Hi guys, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about smooth muscle tissue. We've talked a lot about skeletal muscle in class. Smooth muscle is going to be a little bit different. It's usually activated involuntarily, so you don't have control over this muscle. Fibers are stimulated by certain neurotransmitters, so that is familiar. Usually this is going to be norepinephrine or acetylcholine. Hormones can stimulate smooth muscle, or autorhythmic signals, for example, in the digestive system, helping to move food along. Action potentials are still transmitted through gap junctions. And smooth muscle can be found all over the body in the walls of arteries and veins, hollow organs, airways into the lungs, the erector pili that attach to the hair follicles, the muscles that adjust your pupil diameter, muscles that adjust your lens to help you focus your eyes. So, all over the body, you can find examples of smooth muscle. Usually you can find two layers of smooth muscle, especially in the tubing in the digestive tract, for example. And so you'll have a longitudinal layer that causes dilation and shortening of the organ. So you can see that on the outer layer right here. There's a longitudinal layer that runs down the length of the tube. And you'll also see a circular layer a lot of times that will cause organ constriction and elongation. And so you can see this inner layer right here is a circular layer. You won't necessarily always see two layers, and the stomach, for example, has three layers. But generally, you can oftentimes see two different layers of smooth muscle. When you look at the innervation of smooth muscle, it is different than skeletal muscle. You're still going to see a neurotransmitter that is released and it binds to receptors on the myocyte or the muscle cell, but it is a different scheme than what we see with skeletal muscle. So instead of a neuromuscular junction, you see these varicosities. So here in this zoomed out view, you can see these nerve fibers, and these are autonomic nerve fibers compared to the somatic nerve fibers that we would see in the skeletal muscle tissue. So we have autonomic muscle fiber or nerve fibers that are innervating this smooth muscle, and these little bulges right here are called varicosities. And if we zoom in over here, you can see inside each varicosity, you might see a mitochondria or two, and then you have these vesicles full of neurotransmitter. Now, the neurotransmitter may be different depending on whether the innervation is sympathetic or parasympathetic. With sympathetic innervation, usually the neurotransmitter is norepinephrine, and with parasympathetic innervation, generally the neurotransmitter will be acetylcholine. When this neurotransmitter is released, it can bind to receptors that are located all along this smooth muscle cell. So there's not a particular motor end plate like you see with skeletal muscle. So that's another difference. Smooth muscle tissue will have both thin and thick filament, so you still see the actin, you still see the myosin. The difference is in how they are arranged. They do not form sarcomeres, which is why smooth muscle is not striated as the other two muscle tissues. The arrangement of myosin and actin, they're arranged diagonally, and there's not a regular pattern where they overlap, which contributes to the lack of striations. Instead of T-tubules, we see caveoli in the sarcolemma. And these caveoli are kind of little deposits of calcium. There's also not a whole lot of sarcoplasmic reticulum in smooth muscle tissue, and so most of your calcium is actually going to come from your extracellular fluid, and only a small amount will come from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Instead of Z discs, we see these dense bodies, and they function in sort of the same way as Z discs. They get pulled together by actin and myosin during contraction. And then instead of troponin, we have calmodulin, and this is the protein that is used to bind calcium, and this happens in the cytosol. Calmodulin can then activate your myosin kinase, which will phosphorylate and activate that myosin head. So just to give you a picture of what that looks like, here's your smooth muscle cell, and this is a relaxed myocyte right here. You can see the dense bodies right here, And then you have some intermediate filaments linking them together, some caveolae, some little deposits of calcium here on the sarcolemma. You can see some gap junctions here as well. During contraction, as you see in this figure down here, the dense bodies do get pulled closer to each other. You do see an overall shortening of the muscle cell, but this is not due to a sarcomere that's shortening. So, the nitty-gritty of smooth muscle contraction. So here we see the plasma membrane. Here we see an ion channel that allows calcium inside. Remember, most of your calcium will come from the extracellular fluid when we're talking about smooth muscle. Some will come from the sarcoplasmic reticulum that you see right here. And then that calcium makes its way into the cytosol. As that as that calcium becomes available, calmodulin will activate. So here's what calmodulin looks like as it's inactive, and then as calcium binds, it becomes activated. So this is different than what we see again in skeletal muscle. We see calmodulin binding calcium instead of troponin. This activated calmodulin can then activate a kinase. These are myosin light chain kinases, and they can then catalyze the transfer of this phosphate from ATP onto myosin. So you have this phosphate taken off, and you have this myosin head energized by the energy that it's taken from an ATP. This activated myosin can then form cross bridges. So here's another similarity. And it can move that actin closer, it can shorten it. In addition to the intermediate filaments that we saw on the other picture, you do still have actin and myosin, and they are attached to the dense bodies as well. And so you still see this kind of sliding filament mechanism. But again, instead of troponin, we see calmodulin. And there's overall what it looks like, just for your study purposes. When you're looking at smooth muscle contraction, it starts a little bit slower, but it also lasts a lot longer than what you see with skeletal muscle contraction. You have calcium available in the cytosol for longer. You don't have these pumps that are constantly moving calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum like we see with skeletal muscle. Calcium moves quite slowly out of the muscle fiber, and so that delays the relaxation time. And so in the gastrointestinal tract and your digestive tract, it's important to maintain a steady pressure in order to maintain some tone, as well as in your blood vessels. We call this vasomotor tone. You have to have at least a little bit of contraction that's going on in these areas so that you can maintain movement of food, for example, movement of blood through your blood vessels. If you were to completely lose all of your tone, all of that small state of contraction in your smooth muscle, in your blood vessels, your blood pressure would plummet and it would become very dangerous. In order to get smooth muscle to contract, you have action potentials from the autonomic nervous system. And so again, this is going to be different than skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle would use the somatic nervous system. Both are branches from the peripheral nervous system. So you still get action potentials just from the autonomic side. Stretching can also cause contraction of smooth muscle. So for example, in the digestive tract, as you eat and fill your stomach, the muscle stretches, and that is going to stimulate contraction. And we see this in the blood vessels as well. Hormones can stimulate contraction. Epinephrine causes relaxation of smooth muscle in the airways, also in some blood vessel walls, for example. Changes in pH, changes in oxygen carbon dioxide levels, especially when you start looking at the pulmonary circuit versus the systemic circuit and trying to maximize how much oxygen is able to get to your tissue cells. The smooth muscle can change its state of contraction in response to those. Finally, temperature can cause smooth muscle to contract. Cold temperatures in particular will cause contraction of smooth muscle.